You're listening to Maximum Medicine Radio with host Doc Martin. Stay tuned in or call in. You won't want to miss what's happening next. How do you step into your maximum potential? How do you connect your spiritual drive with your physical path? Stick around as Doc Martin takes listeners on a journey through the seen and unseen, the accepted and the unbelievable. Get ready to meet the maximum you the world needs on Maximum Medicine Radio with Doc Martin now. Hi, everybody. I'm Doc Martin, Maximum Medicine. We're going to have a fun time today because I have with me Dr. Mona Sobhani, and she is trained in the science that I love, and we'll talk about that. But she also has a journey that I want you guys to hear about because you know me, I'm a science girl, I love it. But then there's a whole unseen world that has, for me, become really paramount in how we're going to fix our situation in the world, how we're going to evolve, and all that good, juicy stuff. So I want you to meet Dr. Mona Sobhani, and she's written a book about spiritual phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. So she's going to talk about the stuff we love, right up our alley. But I want you to hear the journey she's walked. So welcome, Mona. I'm so happy you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. So I was a traditional cognitive neuroscientist. I got my Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Southern California, and I studied psychopathic traits and did human neuroimaging. So I had a really traditional path and was very much a scientific materialist, which means that my worldview was what they trained me to have in graduate school, believing that the physical reality is composed of physical matter only, and that there's no external meaning to the universe, that the universe is dead and random and everything is just kind of as it is, but all meaning is created in our brains. So they teach us that our brains are coincidence detectors, that they search for coincidences, and then our brains create meaning from those coincidences and tell stories. Our brains are also storytellers. So that's how they train us. And I think when I went into grad school, I was a little more in awe of the universe and a little more connected and interested in coincidences and things like that. But by the time that I finished my doctorate, which was 6 years later, they had definitely beaten the magic out of me by then. And so by the end of it, I became that very arrogant, condescending scientist who would roll their eyes at anybody who mentioned anything spiritual or religious or metaphysical or woo-woo.
And you know, it's interesting. I'm just thinking about the journey of epigenetics. And we were taught, you had the two-hit theory for cancer. It had to be a genetic mutation. And then, you couldn't do anything because your genes were fixed. And then all of a sudden you recognize, and then here science is scrambling to explain how way back, gosh, I'm going to say late 70s, Candace Pert talked about the molecules of emotion and how Bruce Lipton, Biology of Belief, how all of a sudden you can shift the intracellular environment and open up new chemical pathways and shift disease. So, yeah, and it's almost like science is backpedaling, trying to scramble to make meaning of the stuff. I mean, face it, the shamans would laugh at that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's the same in neuroscience too. They, pretty early on in our training, we did have some professors talk to us about the power of the mind. But, in passing, very fleeting, kind of mentioning if you focus really hard on your, arm, let's say, and imagine it getting hot, like you can actually cause there to be a rash. Like they talked about that with us, but then it was like mentioned in one class and never again. And it's like
they blew it off.
Yeah, they blew it off.
I remember there was a study, gosh, it's at least 30 if not 40 years ago, where they had kids at MD Anderson Cancer Center. This was back when you had Pokemon. So they had them consider their white blood cells to be Pokemon and go and crunch up the cancer. And those kids who did that healed their cancer quicker, faster, better.
Yeah.
And in medicine, I just remember I trained at Johns Hopkins. So we're talking, we're talking pretty academic elite. And there was these physicians, these professors who would dare to say, well, there's the art of medicine. And then talk about, I remember we had this new curriculum that when I started, it was part of, that they had a ribbon of classes through the 4 years that brought in literature and things like that, talked about the art of medicine. And they talked about studies where a doctor could walk in the room and be able to tell you, either in the lower 20%, the upper 20%, or in the middle, how the patient was going to do without ever looking at the chart.
Wow.
Now, today, I could easily tell you, I sense the energy field, I sense the vitality, I sense the life force. So they said, oh, well, this is the art of medicine. That's always some intuition.
Yeah.
I mean, they spent so much time downplaying it, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's really looked down upon to stray from the narrative, the mainstream narrative. It's a really strong stigma, a really strong social stigma. And I remember when I started exploring these topics, that's why I ended up interviewing some of my own colleagues, because I realized after a decade of knowing them, I had no idea if they were spiritual or religious or had ever experienced anything anomalous, because none of us, even though we hung out a lot and we were in each other's social circles, we never discussed things like that. So the stigma is really strong.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, because you fear, there's such a strong peer pressure to not be considered weird or not scientific enough or not data driven.
Mhm. Yes, and there's other layers on top of that. So I remember, so number one, being a woman in science, you already are trying to be taken more seriously. And so you're the last thing you want to do is start talking about something controversial. And the same thing within neuroscience, there's different kinds of neuroscience, like molecular systems, computational, and cognitive. And even within neuroscience, there's some competition between the fields, and cognitive neuroscience can be looked down upon as quote unquote just psychology, and because psychology is looked down upon by the hard sciences. There's all these like nuances of social stigma. And so I remember when I was getting my training, I was like, well, I'm a woman and then I'm doing cognitive neuroscience, and so like the last thing you want to do is talk about anything weird, because you're already fighting an uphill battle.
Well, you're already behind the 8 ball, aren't you?
Mhm.
When I was faculty at Emory University School of Medicine in the Department of Physiology, I was the only woman. Luckily, when I went to medical school, there was a rather innovative dean of admissions who decided to make sure it was at least 50% women.
Oh.
But for years, before I went to medical school, doing my graduate stuff and doing research, being the only woman, go into a room of, when the American Heart Association reviewed the local state grants for funding, and there's no women there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I didn't do very well shutting up, though.
That's good.
I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes it bit me in the butt. Sometimes I got put down pretty severely for not towing the line.
Mm.
But oh well.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had been more like that. I feel like I was more resilient in the beginning, and then I think after years and years, you just start to conform because you get tired. But
Mhm.
yeah.
So here you are walking in what we would call serious science. We would call really grounded in everything the scientific principles teach us, evidence-based, doing, expert experiments using the right statistical approaches and all of that. But something happened. Why don't you tell us about how you opened up to your other side?
Sure. So I was very focused on science. Science was my religion, as I write about in my book. It's because it's kind of a cult, and I was dedicated to it. But I hit a point when I graduated from graduate school and started a position. I sort of started having an existential crisis because I don't know, it was like I had this goal I was working towards, and suddenly I didn't have anything I was working towards specifically. And I woke up starting to be like, is this like, what is the point of being here in this life? Like, is this all we do? Wake up, go to work, and
Mhm.
that's it. And then at the same time, I had a few emotional life events happen. So someone I know was killed, and then a relationship ended, and all this happened, in a few years within each other. And my cultural heritage is that I'm Persian, and in our culture we have a tradition of divination, and my grandmother and my mother do that using coffee grinds. It's not like American coffee grinds, or like a thicker Middle Eastern coffee that you leave
Mhm.
in the cup and it makes pictures. And so my mom would read for me, and I always lived in cognitive dissonance with it because I couldn't explain it with science. But over time, I just realized that she was really like, she would say things that were very private to my life and meaningful to me, but things I would never tell anyone. And she would just know. And she would also predict things happening months in advance, things that I wouldn't know were coming, she wouldn't know were coming. So I always lived in cognitive dissonance. So then around this time when I started having this crisis, she saw a lot of those two emotional events and a few others in the coffees. And I think with the death, I got particularly shook because
Mhm.
it was a life or death thing. It was a very emotional event, and it kind of freaked me out that she had that information like 6 weeks in advance. And she didn't tell me what it was. She knew what it was. She told me afterward that she saw that it was a death and that it was unusual. But at the time, she just kept saying, she's like, I think I need to warn you that you're gonna get some bad news. And she'd never said, usually never said anything like that. But that really shook me. And at the time, it didn't launch me into researching anything, but I think of it as like the legs of a stool being kicked out. So that was one of the legs. Then
Mhm.
the existential crisis was one. And then the relationship was the last leg of the stool. And then after that, I was just like lost my bearings and felt despair and lost hope for the first time. And like, I'm a really positive person usually, and optimistic. And so it was very disorienting. And then that's when I started to get curious about the divination, because it was part of the story or part of what was happening. And it was kind of freaking me out. And I was starting to feel like I didn't understand life. And so I I started I chose to start looking into that instead of looking at myself, which happened later. But I started
No, you
looking into
know,
that.
you're commenting, I'm going to digress a little bit here. You're commenting on something that I've observed in myself and in others. It seems as if these major metaphysical shifts happen to people when they are down and out. Eckhart Tolle,
Mhm.
Immaculée, I forget her name, trapped in the bathroom, hidden in the Rwanda Tutsis and Hutus. I forget
Mhm.
her name. I'm sorry. Um, desperate times where you are so down and everything you believed in is failing you. And for some, it manifests as depression. Some it manifests as a near-death experience. But it seems as if there's this level of you're so down where you're questioning everything or nothing has meaning. And then to me, it seems as if there's a porousness And then you're opening. It's a surrender of sorts, even though you didn't want to surrender and you don't like lying down, being, held under the thumb of the events. But it's like sometimes it seems like those major, major dark nights of the soul end up waking many people up.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Because I
So
would,
here you
yeah.
are in your dark night of the soul. And then what?
Yeah. And well, so I had the readings for my mom and my girlfriends. I live in Los Angeles. And so my girlfriends had been to see intuitives or psychics before. So they took me to one. They're like, we know this lady. She's really good. She'll turn you away if she can't read your energy. So they took me, and then that lady blew my mind. Like, it was even more detailed. She had than my mother, because my mother's readings are more archetypal. But this lady was like, she would name a trauma from my past and get 7 variables right. And I was just staring at her like, who are you? What's happening? I had no idea what was going on. So then my friends and I casually would go and swap readings, because we're like, if they're generic, we should be able to swap. They should be true for all of us, but they weren't. They were specific to us. So we tried different readers. So this went on kind of casually, but I didn't do any research into it. And then finally, I was listening to Chelsea Handler's podcast, which was not about spirituality at all. It was just
No,
her.
she's not, is she? Huh.
But she had, on one of the episodes, she had Laura Lynn Jackson on, who's a psychic medium. And Laura Lynn Jackson started talking about this spiritual framework of reincarnating and soul lessons. And I was like, why does it sound familiar? And I realized that the intuitives I'd gone to see and had said those kinds of things to me in the readings, but they went over my head because I didn't understand them and I didn't believe in them. So I luckily had recorded those readings and taken notes. So I went back later to see, I was like, oh, this seems to be some spiritual belief system that
So
intuitives
you
believe in.
started putting your scientific mind. Um, okay, good. I
Yeah.
love it. Keep telling.
Yeah. So then I reread those notes. I listened to the podcast, and then Chelsea and Laura Lynn mentioned the book Many Lives, Many Masters. And that was like, everyone has like a book. Like, that was the book that changed my life, because I ordered it and didn't know what it was about. I thought it was just a regular case study from a psychiatrist. So I started reading it, and it's a past life regression story. So it was really interesting. And because Brian Weiss, the author, or Dr. Brian Weiss was trained at Yale and Columbia, I was a snob. I was
You were
very,
ready. You were more easily ready to believe him.
yeah, I mean, he resonated with me, his background. He was well-trained, scientific. I think he was like an atheist maybe, but he didn't believe in any of it. And he just wrote, in a very like matter-of-fact tone, this story that happened to him. So it caught my attention. So I read all of his books, and then all the references in his books. And then it just started from there. But it was, what was really fascinating to me, it is coming at it from like a scientific perspective. And I didn't just believe, I mean, the worldview flip and the belief changes, that was all happening, but it would take a long time to really happen, because my ego was like, no, like, what's happening? We work so hard for this science identity, like, we can't let it go. But I started to just build, like triangulation. I'm like, okay, so I have this information from the psychics and intuitives, which is interesting because they didn't grow up with families that believe in this framework. They're telling me that they learned this framework from their spirit guides. And then I go to Brian Weiss's literature, which is past life regression. I'm like, okay, so if you put a patient in an ultra relaxed, hypnotized state, no matter what their background is, that they report the same framework. And so then I started looking at NDEs and the reincarnation studies from children, the past life ones from the University of Virginia. And it started snowballing from there, where I just thought, there's actually a lot of evidence for at least for us to question whether there's a spiritual or mystical dimension. It's not as cut and dry as mainstream science and the Western worldview make it appear like it is.
So what was one of the things, one of your experiences with an intuitive? Can you give a personal story that really rocked you? Without, you don't have to share anything too private, but
Yes. Well, I have a friend who's very intuitive now. We met through when I was doing interviews with people, and now we're best friends. But he's the most intuitive person I've ever met, and he blows me away daily. It's like I mean, he says he can talk to my guides, and so my guides are always like ratting me out to him like on things. But so what the one of the moments with him was I have another I have a name in Farsi, which is my parents' language, which is different from my American name. But in my head, I don't even consider myself as having two names. I just have a family name, and then I have Mona, which everyone else calls me. But one time when he was trying to give me a message from one of my guides, and I think I was like, didn't like the message or something, or wasn't paying attention. And he said, "Oh, your guide is telling me to ask you about your other name." And then I just was staring at him like, what other name? And I didn't click at first, because again, I don't think of myself as having two names. And then he was saying it. Um, and and then he got my attention, and I stopped, and I was like, "Oh my God, how did you know that?" And he's like, "Well, your guide just said it. She wants you to believe what I'm saying. So she told me to tell you your other name." And so that was insane to me, because nobody, even when I told the story to my best friends, even they don't think of me with that name. Like they know I have it, but they don't, nobody thinks of me as having two names. So it was really interesting. And that happened a second time with another intuitive who's unrelated to me. Like I don't know them, they're not a friend. So and when that happened, I thought, this is just very creepy and weird. This is just too much. Like
I
nobody knows.
remember
Yeah.
when I was younger, my sister and I used to go down to, I lived outside of DC in Bethesda, Maryland, and we used to go down to DC outside of Chinatown to see a woman who was a known psychic. And she used, it's interesting, and you probably experienced this with the different intuitives. She seemed to use tarot cards as her mechanism to focus and bring the messages through. And she would say things, and then we'd be like, wait, and we go home, and on our way home, we talk about it and realize, having never seen us before, never met us before, and she knows stuff. And that's when, this was, I guess I was in my early 20s, and that's when I began to say, well, listen, if they're able to see this and know this, there has to be some kind of universal truth,
Right.
because otherwise, where they're getting it from. And then when I studied shamanism and I was taking a training, and we had to do these intuitive readings for a classmate. So I sit down with a classmate, and I'd never worked with her in the class before. And we have 3 stones, and I'm supposed to do a reading. And I hold up this stone, one of my stones from my medicine bundle, and the stone is really gray with some brown and white spots on it. It's not like there's no pictures on it, but I'm seeing very, very clearly this picture, and of a boat in unstable water, big waves, boat, and I have this knowing that the boat is about to capsize. But the boat is moving from right to left on the stone, and it's entering peaceful where the sun is shining. And I think to myself, okay, I can't tell her this because this is frickin' wackadoo. And I'm looking at the stone, and the image is very clear to me. And I said, okay, I'm in this class for a reason. I've got to put my suspend disbelief, put my science brain aside. And I've just got to surrender to this and tell her this message, because I think I'm wacko. She's going to think I'm wacko, but oh well, maybe it's just a game we're playing. So I tell her, you're in a boat. It's very stormy. It's very up, it's going to be topsy-turvy, and you fear you're going to capsize. But I'm telling you, the boat is entering still waters and the sun is shining. You're going to be okay.
Mm.
Well, I thought she was going to look at me like I had three heads. So she starts crying. I said, I'm sorry, did I upset you? She said, I had a dream last night. Things are so stressful in my life right now. I had a dream that I was in a boat and I was going to capsize.
Oh my gosh.
And I said, but you're not going to, because it was very clear. She said, things are, she had a divorce, she's moving, she changed jobs, I mean, it was mountain of horribleness for her.
Yes.
And that's when I just said, that's when you've got to just surrender to it, because there's some information coming from somewhere else.
Mhm.
And, science never validated it, so I can't trust that. But anyway, I want to hear more about where this somewhere else is. We're going to take a short break. But when we come back, I want you to say, you sort of approached these intuitives with a scientific experiment and data collection. So I want to hear about that. And then I want you to tell everybody what you've discovered. So we'll take a short break. Hi, everybody. We're back. I'm Doc Martin on Maximum Medicine. I'm here with Dr. Mona Sobhani, and we're talking about how you can wake up to the spirit world. You can wake up to the intuitive world. And I want her to talk about her journey in that. So, Mona, take it away.
Yes. So my journey started with getting readings from other people and from intuitives or psychics or my mother. And then I decided to start interviewing them actually, because I was curious as a neuroscientist how they were perceiving or receiving this information, because some of them would say, oh, I feel it in my body, or I see it. I was like, do you see it with your eyes or is it in your imagination? So I started interviewing them to get an idea. Oh, and also I think I mentioned previously, but I wanted to ask them about their backgrounds. Like, did they learn these skills from their families? Did they adopt these frameworks from the spiritual beliefs from their families? But it turned out most of them were at odds with their families, actually, and they had these gifts from childhood and thought it was normal until, at some point growing up, they realized it wasn't normal. So it was really, really interesting to interview them and start with that perspective. And then I moved, as I was reading research, I decided to start interviewing my scientist colleagues because I started to have an identity crisis, right? I started to open my mind, but then my science ego was getting really upset about that. And I started to freak out. So I decided to speak to my colleagues and ask them, if they were spiritual or if they had ever experienced anything anomalous. And most of them were very open. All of them had a story, whether it was their own or somebody that they knew. They all shared weird stories with me. And we all, in these private conversations, just talked about how science is supposed to be about openness and curiosity. And if there's even one data point, that goes against the model and you can't explain it, then it means the model needs to change. So it's like we were all trained really well. And it reminded me that the foundations are good. It's just that when you go into practice, to practice science, it's the systems that don't let you do it the way you want to. So I interviewed them and that was fun. And then as I was reading actual scientific research into psychic phenomena or the reincarnation stuff, I started to reach out to researchers who are doing that work and speak to them. And because I was like, are they crazy? Maybe they're nuts. But then they weren't, they were just normal scientists. So it was all really informative. And I think that and that was all. I kept reading a lot and interviewing because that's right. I was so left brained, and that's what I knew to do, to research and to ask questions and to take notes. And then everyone kept telling me, oh, at some point you'll have to start experiencing these things or start engaging with it. And I kept brushing it off because I was scared. And I had always been meditating anyway. Like I think I had been meditating for 3 years up to that point, like just in the mornings for 20 minutes or so. So at some point I did start doing that and I started exploring. So I did past life regression, and then I did breath work. I tried psychedelics. I started exploring all kinds of things, just to get in touch with that other side of reality. And I started realizing that when I was younger, I used to have precognitive dreams, and they stopped like sometime probably when I started graduate school, or I just started ignoring them. I don't know. But when I started doing all this, they started coming back in a flood, and then and a lot of other waking moments of intuition became much stronger. So I mean, and that's just continuing to happen a lot. That's just happening on a rolling basis. So, but it was like a solidification, because I thought that as a scientist, I only needed science, that I only needed facts. But I was learning that as I was reading all this research and even doing the interviews, even that was not enough to convince my ego. Like my ego was still, everything was still resisting. I was still resisting. But once the personal experiences started to pile up, um, it was like you had, two sources of evidence, personal and then scientific. And at that point, you're like, well, what am I even doing? What am I holding on to? This doesn't even make sense anymore. It's just unscientific to cling to something that doesn't work for me anymore. So at that point, I finally accepted that my former worldview is probably not the right one in the least. I may not know what the right one is, but at least I know that materialism was not really working, because it was not explaining what I was experiencing on a daily basis. And I also took the spiritual belief system. I thought, this really interesting reincarnation and soul lessons. And I thought, oh, I'll just take it for a test drive. And I found that it was really useful. So as a scientist, science is not very comforting. Like when you're in a crisis, nobody like goes to the science section of a bookstore. Like there's nothing comforting. It's for me. There's nothing comforting in science. Um, and I used to look down on spirituality. A lot of people in science do, because they say it's a coping mechanism for humans to make it through life, which is hard. But I found that spirituality was actually very useful and valuable, and it alleviated a lot of my suffering, and even that psychological reframing of why is this happening to me, and turning that into what should I be learning here, was surprisingly very helpful. And then also I think in a lot of the books, I think this was even in Brian Weiss's books, he talks about the meaning of life being just enjoying every moment, the small moments or your relationships. And I think I had lost sight of that. So it brought that back to my awareness, and I started actively doing that. I had been practicing mindfulness, but this was a whole new level. And it really did bring more joy to my life. And I started enjoying my cup of coffee or the sunlight or whatever it was. So it turned out that it was extremely valuable and helpful. And then after I adopted it, I couldn't believe I had lived any other way beforehand. I was like, what did I even do before? Like, how did I even
Well, that's what
function?
people ask me, like, why, how did shamanism change you, or how did learning shamanism? And what I realized is when I grew up with a lot of anxiety and uncertainty and needing to control what's around me in order to feel safe. And then all of a sudden, I'm opened up to the unseen world and the places that spirit guides live, how you sense them, whether you sense them as actual beings or energies or vibratory frequencies, and then, the nature elements, and then to recognize my relationship with nature, to learn that or to open up to that. And all of a sudden, I realized that I wouldn't trade this for the world, because it is comforting, it's reassuring, it's security producing. And to know that I have, however you want to frame it, to me, I have allies in the unseen world. I have these intelligences that I can communicate with and that can assist me. I've never felt that growing up. I never felt any of that. And so
Yeah.
I can't even imagine that somebody would want to live in a world without feeling that.
Yeah. I agree. That was one of the things that I found comforting too when I started going to really good intuitives or met my friend, and he would start giving me messages from my guides, and they would, like I mentioned, they would tell him basically my day-to-day movements and activities to, so I was like, are they with me all the time? Like, why do they know everything? And he's like, yeah, basically. And that took some getting used to, but then it's like you said, it's kind of funny because you're before that you're really, really alone, but you don't realize you're super alone. But then suddenly when you're like, oh, maybe I do have like consciousnesses or intelligences supporting me, that's a really nice idea. And why would I trade that?
And here for me is where it went into the world where I could panic about being stigmatized. And I tell this often on my radio show that when I went to Sedona years ago with a group and I literally met a dragon. Now I was told that we were going to meditate to sense the dragon because this guy who lives in Sedona uh, connects with them and all that. And to me, I said, okay, I'm good. Whatever I sense, I'm going to call it a dragon. He said it's going to be a dragon. Okay, it's a dragon. I felt an energy that I felt something real, and it traveled home with me.
Mm,
And since that time, and is it really to have the shape that we consider a dragon to have? I don't know, but it is definitely for me a current of energy of creative force of the earth. And
mhm,
there's some that are of the skies, the celestial and all that. But so I started a relationship with these energies, and they are with me every day, and they matter, and they offer me wisdom. So that's something that for me anyway, recognizing that the indigenous ways of interacting with nature and the spirit world offers such connection
mhm.
and guidance.
Yes.
Why would we not want that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when I was trying to wrap my head around all of this, I understand what you mean by, you get worried about the stigma because in Western culture, you don't want to say you believe in dragons or fairies or whatever. But at some point, I realized that if you just, what I started doing mentally, at least to help me understand, was I just started removing the labels and started imagining everything as just energy, which they say it is anyway.
Mhm.
But and then when you read, Carl Jung and learn about the archetypes and Joseph Campbell and the myths and all that, you realize that there's this like qualitative aspect to the universe, that you can't, like, and these energies have qualities, and we may call them things, or different cultures may call them
Mhm.
different things, but it doesn't really matter. We call them things for convenience because we speak language and that's how we have to communicate. But if you just take those away, then okay, they're just energies. And there's a
And
lot we don't understand.
when you ask people to describe, like in this meditation group in Sedona, when he said, we're going to bring forth this dragon, and afterwards we debriefed about it, we all felt qualities that were consistent throughout the group, that were not just generic exists everywhere qualities, but distinct. And so, how you can't argue with that.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, so first of all, I was in Sedona last week for the first time ever, and it was magical. And I did this meditation with somebody over Zoom a few years ago, And he was like, we're just gonna, I didn't know him that well, but he was an engineer, a scientist. And he was like, I do these with people, I guide them through meditation, and then we'll connect, we'll disconnect, we'll meditate, we'll come back online, and then I'll tell you what I saw, and you just tell me if you saw anything. And so we did it, and I wasn't expecting anything. I wrote down a few things that I saw, and I don't remember all of them. I just remember I wrote down dragon, because one of the clearest things I saw was this like big green dragon. And I'm not a dragon fanatic. I never think about dragons ever. So it was really unusual. So I wrote that down. So anyway, as he's telling me whatever, all these things about that he saw, he gets to a portion where he starts talking about a dragon, and he describes exactly what I saw. And I just started flipping out, because this was pretty early in the journey. And I just thought, this is insane. Like, I never think about dragons. Like, how did he see what I saw? So it was one of those phenomenal moments.
You know, it's interesting because I had a show where I interviewed a seventh generation Mongolian shaman, and there was a translator there. And before we did the show, I met the guy online, and the question through the interpreter to me was, what animals do you connect with? Well, I've always connected with the jaguar and the bear. So I'm saying, and the interpreter shaking his head. And the shaman says, and I said, well, I don't know what to say. And the interpreter says, he said, no, he said, it's dragons. He sees dragons all around you. Now, this is whatever, 13,000 miles away, somebody I'd never met before. And he knows that and I said, you're right, that's who I really talk to every day.
Oh, wow.
I mean, isn't that wild? But
Yeah,
anyway.
I love that. I love those stories.
So we have 10 minutes left. What have you learned that you want to share with our listeners? What have you learned about through your interviews of all of these intuitives and psychics and energy movers?
I think the most important thing is that there is meaning. So for me, I feel like part of my crisis was that everything seemed meaningless to me. And I think coming to the readings, like I still love getting readings, not for future predictions or whatever, but I just love intuitives who can tap in and kind of, when you're not intuitive, I'm much better with connecting with myself now, but earlier I was not. And so it's nice to have somebody kind of tap in and kind of teach you about yourself. It's
Mhm.
really interesting, because a lot of us are really out of touch with ourselves, because we don't, we lose our identities, or we just become what society wants us to be. And I remembered that these readings were so healing for me, because there was a lot of that, a lot of telling me things about myself, which sounds ridiculous, but I was so out of touch with who I was that it would shake me to my core, and I would
And it's
go,
so reassuring
yeah.
when a complete stranger reminds you that you are significant in the world, enough to be known in this universal truth, Akashic record, whatever divine matrix, they can see you and describe you.
Yeah.
Then, for me, it was always, I have a place.
Mm.
It was always, if they can see me, then I'm known to the world. I'm known to the universe. I am something.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way to describe it. Yeah. It's um it just brings this like sparkling meaning back into your life,
Mhm.
and it makes things easier. So I think that that's probably the biggest thing. Oh, I mean, also I just learned that I don't know anything, and that I should stay open and curious, because I
Mhm.
thought I knew everything, and obviously I didn't. So to stay really open, and stop judging so much, because I remember early on I would really judge anything that would come out of their mouths. And the intuitives and psychics, I would say, like, what are they talking about? These people are nuts. And then at some point I just dropped that, and I thought, well, what if I'm wrong? Like, what if I just listened and stopped And then it became a lot easier. I mean, it was honestly, it was just nicer to be in that kind of a state than it was to be in a judgmental one. And so that kind of thing started to shift the way I behave in the world, and it was beneficial.
How do you think mindfulness meditation helped you?
Mindfulness meditation helps me come back to the moment, and something, I mean, I'm not perfect at it. My mind still reels from the past to the present a lot, but I'm a lot better at kind of pulling myself into the moment and focusing on what I'm doing and not worrying. I think I really could not stop worrying before. I couldn't get out of the mental loop, which is funny because as a neuroscientist, we know a lot about the brain, but we really don't know anything about the mind and how to control it or work with it. And so I had to learn all of that through this spiritual journey, not through my training. And I've become a lot more familiar with my mind through meditation and observing it and looking at my beliefs and all of that. So actually, a lot of the intuitive readings I went to brought my attention to that too. They would say, you know, like, oh, the reason you receive things in your dreams is because your daytime mind is so busy. Like they can't get, nothing can get it. You're so loud, like so many thoughts, lots of electricity. So things like that started to get me to pay attention to my mind and my attention, where it's going, and to try to not let it wander by itself wherever it goes. And the one thing I do have that benefits me as a neuroscientist is understanding that my past has shaped my brain in a way that brings my attention to things, you know, based on my personality, my traumas or whatever. And at least, and then now I realize I can start, it's important to address those things and rewire my brain because, you know, I'm co-creating this reality. So it makes it a priority for me to pay attention to where I'm putting my attention and focus.
And I think, tell me if this was echoed by all the people you interviewed. We have an eternal self.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and just in the few minutes we have left, see if you can have a comment on this. There's a consciousness that exists outside of our human material existence.
Yeah. Yeah. They, um, you mean like a higher self type of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
or a soul.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's been, I found that to be a very comforting thought, except when she has planned things I don't like that my conscious will doesn't like. But I find it comforting. I mean, definitely I think it's, I wonder if I'm trying to think if I had a problem with this. I think even early on, I was open to the idea of consciousness surviving death. And then when I read the evidence, that just supported it. To me, that was never such a crazy idea,
Mhm.
as it seems to be for a lot of people. That one was not that hard, for me to get my head around. And I've always been open to that in some way, shape, or form. And I do find that very comforting because I mean, yeah, it's not the end. It's like this life is like a stop on a train ride. I think that obviously it's hard when you lose people, but I think that at least that's there. It's a little bit comforting.
Mhm. There is an ongoing current, as I understand it, real time um, disagreement as to whether or not consciousness resides in our material brains.
Mm.
Do you have any insight on that?
From everything I've read and experienced, I lean more towards the brain being a receiver, of consciousness. Uh, yeah, I really don't. I mean, I know there's a lot of different models, but I definitely lean more towards that one.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, or all of nature, or the nature reality being consciousness in some way, and it not even mattering if there's a brain or not. I don't know. I lean more towards that now. I definitely, obviously, before was in the neuroscience camp of consciousness is produced by the brain.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
but now I think that there's just too much evidence that that model doesn't explain, that we have to be open to other ideas.
So before we're getting ready to close, just remind people what the title of your book is and where they can get it.
Yes, my book is called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. And you can get it wherever books are sold. It's also on my website, which is monasobhaniphd.com.
Wonderful. Mona, it was so wonderful to have you here tonight to talk.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
for,
having me.
thank you for joining me. I love this stuff. I love the journey you went on, and thanks for sharing it. Emily, thanks for production, and we'll close now. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Maximum Medicine Radio with Doc Martin. Tune in next time while the doc talks health, spirituality, and the impact your beliefs have on every part of who you are, body and soul. Doc Martin unpacks the challenges we face as human beings and teaches callers to open the door between the scientific and the mystical. To learn more about Doc Martin and Maximum Medicine, visit www.sharonmartinmd.com.